Hi, this is Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology, and today I'm doing a video blog on the question, how does astrology work? Now, this is a topic that I've decided to cover after a recent video that I did on the intersection between modern psychology and astrology. After that recording, I got a lot of questions from people basically surrounding the question of well, how exactly does astrology work, or what exactly is it doing, and things like that. So today's talk has been designed to at least present an overview of some of the major ideas about how astrology works, and in particular, my own views as an astrologer as to how astrology works. Now, two particular ideas about how astrology works. We're going to be looking at these two today. And I want to just say right away that this doesn't mean that there isn't a huge history of different ideas and philosophical speculation over thousands of years about how and why astrology works the way that it does. So this, almost, I always sort of try to say this at a lot of the beginning of my talks, but this is not meant to be authoritative or the definitive final answer, right? Today's thoughts hopefully inspire, stir up conversation, and present to you sort of the positions that I've arrived at over 7 years of full-time practice and more than a decade of being devoted student of astrology. And other people out there, I also defer to my colleagues and other astrologers, and to all of you and your experiences as well. They're all, in a sense, a part of, in my opinion, a continued working out of our understanding of how astrology works. So I don't really think that we ever come to a full understanding of how the universe works, right? We have to be very careful not to, be proud, right? We don't want to be arrogant about this, but there are a few things that I want to look at today. There are two major positions that I'm going to be exploring very broadly, and intricate, involved conversations about either position, again, could take place. But very broadly speaking, the two positions are the causal position about how astrology works, and what I also am going to refer to very broadly as the divinatory position. So there's the causal and divinatory positions. The causal position is the one that I think a lot of people take up knowingly or unknowingly, especially in modern astrology. And it has a deep, long history in astrology. It's not just modern, but I think it's probably really predominant in today's astrology. The causal premise goes like this. The planets are causing things to happen. That's it. It's that simple. It's just the planets in the sky, as they're doing whatever they're doing, are responsible for things happening the way that they do. So you get this, for example, in the modern astrological lingo. You see it everywhere online when people say, "Oh, Saturn's really messing with me," right? Or you say, Saturn's going like this and going like this. It's talked about as though it is as causal as, say, like a rainstorm coming through. It's going to be wet outside. It's like physical conditions that the planets are somehow beaming down, right? That's the causal position. Causal position says the planets are like causal influences, or causal rays or beams, that the planets somehow are mechanically creating certain kinds of conditions or even kinds of outcomes or events. A lot of people believe that, and it's not necessarily something that you really look into or get really deeply involved with. That's just the position. So for example, how does it work? If we're talking about how does astrology work, one of the questions you might have would be like, how does it work that Saturn entering the 7th house of your birth chart creates a divorce, or means a divorce, or causes a divorce? Does it cause the divorce? How does it mean that, or how does it work that Jupiter entering a 10th house results in promotion? How does a birth chart work at all to be able to say accurate things about a person or the past, present, or future, right? These kinds of questions are at the heart of how does astrology work? And the causal position is roughly It works because the planets transmit energy or beams or influences or rays or some kind of physical causal power that creates the changes or conditions occurring in the world. So that's the first position. Now, what I want to do is break down some of the more specific details about this position and then outline why it's not for me, why I personally don't take up this position, and what I do take up in its place. And again, food for thought. If you disagree or agree with me, no big deal. This is hopefully what I really want my video blog to bring to people is deeper astrological content, but in a good spirit, not in the I'm trying to convert you to anything necessarily. I try to make good arguments from my point of view, though. So how is it? Let's talk about the causal point of view in birth charts in general. The birth chart works because this is the causal point of view, sort of speaking, for a long time now. This goes all the way back in some ways to Ptolemy, one of the earlier astrologers, later Hellenistic tradition, but still an early astrologer and someone who's had a authoritative influence throughout much of the rest of the history of astrology since Ptolemy. The birth chart works because the heavens impress upon the seedling of the child at the moment of its birth a kind of energetic blueprint. Now, this is the view that I would say most people in modern astrology have. And I myself sort of discovered through reading other people who have pointed this out, my favorite author being Jeffrey Cornelius in a book called The Moment of Astrology, which is a fantastic book if you really want to get deep into these questions. That, wow, yeah, that's what I believe. Was there any other way to believe? I thought that's what astrology is. So let's say it again. The child is born at a particular moment, and it's sort of like a piece of clay. And the planets at the moment of birth are sort of impressing upon that piece of clay certain kind of subtle, energetic blueprint or makeup, right? That's the basic causal idea. And then the life is about the plant growing into sort of growing into and expressing those impressions that are imprinted upon it at the hour of birth by the planets. That's predominantly the modern perspective on astrology. So life is an expression of the combinations of energies impressed upon the child at birth. The life will thus play out within the parameters of these expressions, but especially in modern astrology, what we emphasize is that the more that you understand the energetic patterns impressed upon you at birth, and you understand those parameters, the more that the parameters become something like energetic possibilities. And the more real control you have over how these energies manifest or are used, the more that your chart becomes a little bit like a pair of virtual reality goggles. You're sort of, you take the joystick. If you don't understand the chart and its energetic possibilities, then it will sort of play out however it plays out, and consciously it'll just grow into, some expression of those qualities. But if you really know them, then you get to shape it the way that you want. Now that's the view that the planets impress upon the child some kind of causal influence at the hour of birth is old. But the view that you get to know those patterns, they become possibilities, you sort of then grab the virtual reality stick and create it to be what you want it to be, is new. That's relatively new. And it's a predominant way, a philosophical lens that is used all over modern astrology. Again, like I said, the view that the planets have some impression upon the child at birth dates back to Ptolemy, though. That itself is very old. And Ptolemy's model of the cosmos was originally a kind of scientific model. It was attempting to explain, in some ways, the mechanics of celestial influence upon earthly matters. And it was astronomy, but it was also it was astronomy, it was wrapped in with astrology, but it was also, it was part of a sort of blossoming, slow, gradual blossoming of materialist science, where your basic interest is the mechanics of material reality. Ancient astrologers, to some extent, are interested in the mechanics of material reality because they're interested in the mechanics of karma, which they see as the operating rules of material reality. So originally there is some connection between, astronomy and sort of science and astrology. They're interested in the study or laws of fate, which are thought to be the governing cause and effect sort of rules of material reality. So these early theories, in a sense, begin very spiritually. However, at a certain point, modern science basically disproves Ptolemy's causal model, right? Ptolemy's explanation of how things work in the universe or in the cosmos at large is disproved. There's no observable, and now really there's no observable scientific explanation for the planets creating divorces, promotions, deaths in the family, or whatever else. There's no, like, in the spirit that Ptolemy started in with trying to explain the sort of operating laws of the cosmos, there's no that attempt has failed, right? It doesn't work. It's also, again, really pretty new to view the chart as a set of sort of energetic impressions and possibilities that you can gain control of and navigate. That's also very new. Now, I have various reasons for rejecting these models. One of them is just that very, very simply, most causal models of astrology cannot be proved in the language of scientific materialism. Like, you can't sit down and you're not going to be able to convince scientifically minded people that there is a really good, scientifically sound explanation for how astrology works. You can try to do all sorts of gymnastics with things like quantum mechanics and stuff like that, but at the end of the day, there's no great explanation as to why you can use birth charts and get really amazingly accurate predictions, right? It's not, at least it's not easy, and it puts a target on our backs. It makes us pretty much look like idiots, in my opinion, to try and explain astrology in the language of causal, modern science. So that's me, though. Take that or leave it. Ancient astrologers also believed in fate and karma, and though free will existed for ancient astrologers alongside of providence and other things, the modern notion that our chart is a set of energetic possibilities to be sort of understood and then manipulated to create what we want isn't really true to the tradition. The main reason for this is really simple. Ancient astrologers were not overly impressed with using your will to produce things in material reality in the first place. Like, for many different ancient mystics, material realm is a place of, it's samsara. It's thought to be sort of illusory. It's in flux. It's impermanent. It's always moving. Time is thought of as cyclical. And in a certain sense, even cause and effect, the realm of cause and effect, the material realm of cause and effect, is thought itself to be an illusion. So the spirit or soul that is traveling through this world can easily get bound up and misidentified with these material illusions, and the whole realm of cause and effect is part of that. So for them, there never would have been an emphasis on trying to jimmy rig your chart to get the best thing that you want, or at the least there were probably very clear delineations between people who were using, like there are in all different kinds of traditions, who are using spiritual technology for the sake of getting something that they want, and for the sake of understanding the consciousness that is behind or within the material experience that a person is having. So that's just, again, just like drawing that distinction for me is really important, because, insofar as astrology is seen as like, well, get to know your chart and then you get to kind of create your own reality. First of all, that's not in line with the view of fate and karma that most ancient astrologers had, which is important to think about. I mean, we really do have to think about that. But also, again, it's like the appropriate use of the will is really to train oneself to become identified with their consciousness, the spirit or the soul, or with God, however you want to call it. And so, it's not so important that you like figure out how to do your best Venus so that you can get like the world's greatest like marriage, or it's not like do the best Mars that you can do so that you get your best career or something like that. That's really not the emphasis for ancient astrologers. And for me, it hasn't been either. Like in my practice, that has felt, as I've, kind of advanced along the path of my spiritual practices, that has become more and more of a sort of absurd idea. That's not to say that I'm not interested in utilizing choice or free will. It's just a sort of, there's a kind of spiritual materialism potentially behind the whole paradigm of taking your chart's possibilities and getting what you want out of them. Now, at any rate, many ancient mystics, again, believed that time was cyclical, the material world was more or less deterministic, which is exactly why it's not really the place to go looking for happiness. So in order to find happiness, we have to understand the meaning, and to understand the meaning of choice and freedom, we have to understand the laws of karma. They go together. So astrology is always really a study of karma or fate, and not energetic possibilities and how to use them to manifest the world that you want. That's also not to say that ancient astrologers believed unanimously that the material world was evil or bad either. Now, the other, so those are sort of some of my reasons for like not getting down with the causal model. I don't believe, to summarize, I don't believe we have a really great way of appealing to modern science, nor do I think we should. Also, I'm not interested in the idea of planetary influences and energies, because I feel that it feeds into a notion of free will and the use of free will with those energies that produces a kind of spiritual egoism. Now, those are just, those are my perspectives, especially having sat with thousands and thousands of clients over the years. Now, in the other model that I want to talk about today is called the divinatory model. This is just broadly speaking. The divinatory model suggests that astrology is a form of divination, that it's not in a strict sense some kind of cosmic science. That is not to say that there aren't very interesting mechanisms or laws at place within divination itself, which I'll talk about in a minute, but it separates it from the language and the mindset and the mood of modern science a great deal. So the divinatory model would suggest, for example, that astrology is really a lot like tarot. It's really a lot like runes. It's really a lot like the omens that appear in dreams. It's really a lot like the bird or animal in nature that crosses your path and has a message for you. That it participates in a lineage of divination, and that's where I stand with my practice. So we get caught up in thinking, I think, that astrology is some kind of causal science, and like ancient people were starting to do, and a long history of starting to get caught up in trying to explain. There's a study of fate, and there's a knowledge that there's laws at work, but somehow, Ptolemy kind of going forward, there becomes this almost like the emphasis starts to shift from the mystical experience of divination to the attempt to explain causally how astrology works. And it's a part of an overall weight that's placed on the shoulders of astrology to become a physical, material, explanatory science for all of reality, right? Like nobody puts the weight on the shoulders of tarot to explain the laws of reality, right? And I think the only reason we do that with astrology is because astrology is rooted in math and astronomy. So because it's rooted in math and astronomy and sort of the observable physical world, and it has this long history of being wrapped up in the scientific spirit and trying to explain the physical laws of reality, that people still think of it like a material science. There's a mood that surrounds it that's like, oh, it's like a material science. But again, like we don't place that burden, right? We don't place that burden on our dreams. We don't place that burden on a deck of tarot cards. There's no emphasis on other forms of divination to be ultimate explanatory models of how every last thing works or why every single thing is happening. So I think we get caught up because of the astronomical and mathematical nature of astrology, thinking that it's a literal material science, and that starts to create all sorts of distortions. Divination, of course, suggests an intelligence that's behind or within the material universe and the sort of realm of cause and effect for certain, but its laws are deeply mysterious. And the more that you study divination, the more that you start to actually see what mystics have been telling us over a long period of time, which is that all of time is co-present. The past, the present, and future are all simultaneous to one another. That the appearance of cause and effect is an illusion in the totality of time, which itself is cyclical. These are things that ancient mystics have said, that you practice astrology or divination long enough, you start to actually grok, like you start to actually get it. And it's not, it's something that demonstrates itself, that's felt, that becomes an intelligence that lives in your body, but it's not something that we're putting the cart before the horse if we try to make material science arrive at its conclusions prior to practicing its conclusion. Like its answer is something we arrive at by practicing it as an answer. If that's, I know that must sound sort of ridiculous, but so there is an intelligence. Don't get me wrong. There is an intelligence. There is rationality, reasonableness. There's beautiful sort of architecture at work. But one of the main things that we have to, again, just sort of, we have to get into our mind and body is that it's not something that you can get to with the same kind of mindset and mentality as science. You can't, because in science, one of the main things that we're trying to do is we're trying to break things apart and understand how they work. This view teaches us how things work, but it does so by collapsing differences into paradoxical unions. And it's a totally different kind of practice. It's like saying you should really be, if you really want to study science, you need to do yoga. If you really want to study science, you need to practice divination, not just one form of divination probably, but a few, so that you really don't get distracted by astrology's apparently, appearing objective scientific mood. At any rate, in the Bhagavad Gita, for example, Krishna, is like an avatar, tells Arjuna that the laws of karma are deeply mysterious and not even the wisest sages understand them. He's talking to Arjuna at a time where, the Vedas, the great scientific, basically the great scientific ritual database of the Indian people was at play in the world. And here's Krishna saying, they have these highly evolved ritualistic practices and astrology and things like that. And Krishna's saying, yeah, but not even the wisest of the people who are doing these things understand the laws behind them. So that's really weird to us, because for us in the modern scientific mindset, we think you have to really understand the laws of something thoroughly before you can do it or before you know how it works. And the truth is that with astrology, it's actually fundamentally the opposite. In some ways, you practice astrology and you're practiced it because you learn certain kinds of rules and certain kinds of methods. But as you go along, the actual practice of it is what teaches you about the intelligence behind it. So that's, again, fundamentally different than looking at the planets and saying like, oh, the planets are causing X, Y, or Z to occur. So divination is sort of like a symbolic science. It works in a way that's really mysterious to the rational linear mind. And we have to remember that all of the ancient sages who invented/received the system of astrology believed that they were given it by gods, right, or by God. So, and that part of it for us now, in some ways, we when we get into the sort of pseudoscientific language of causality, the planet's causing this, the planet's causing that, this planet's really messing with me, or something like that, or we talk about them as influences and so on and so forth. We're really, and then we think sometimes that we're really evolved, like we've really come such a long way. Now we have this like much more sort of universal, objective language in which to talk about this stuff. But I think sometimes it's actually just the opposite. Sometimes we it wouldn't hurt us to go back to understanding that the entire system was received in mystical states of consciousness. Like a little bit more of that would be helpful. I can't tell you how many people, if I say, how does astrology work, rather than saying it's a deep mystery, it was received by ancient mystics, they'll start talking to me about Jung's theory of synchronicity, just to be simple about it. That's the kind of problem that I'm careful of in my own practice. At any rate, here's something that we can say this: for ancient sages, if time is cyclical, right? Think about that. If time is cyclical, if cause and so everything is sort of already co-present in a sense. There's a totality and a unity to time, and it's a cyclically repeating system. Then all that you need within that system to accurately talk about anything in that system is something that mirrors that system. Right? So with astrology, with tarot, with all different kinds of systems of divination, what you often see are closed systems of symbolic, of symbols that move in recurring ways, that have a cyclical dynamic to them, like the I Ching, for example, which moves through a total cycle of stages that repeats endlessly. You have astrology, which is the exact same thing, with planetary cycles sort of moving endlessly. In the tarot, you have the same thing happen in a sort of visual narrative form through the journey of the major arcana, sort of cycling endlessly, or the numbered cards sort of telling a story and cycling endlessly. Same thing with the court cards. So in all of these systems, there's something in which there is a sequence in time that's mapped out through different layers of the symbolism, and yet the total system repeats itself sort of endlessly. All the divinatory models sort of have that in common. And when you get to know the relationships between the symbols within that world, that's what's actually facilitating the ability to prognosticate past, present, and future. But you have to remember that even for ancient sages, all of that was still taking place in a sphere of karma or fate, that there were still intelligences above that had control over, like God's providence, or angels, or potentially even your guru, or saintly people, that there have always been forces that are in a sense higher than and can intervene within that realm as well. And so astrology has never really been some kind of, I mean, to some people a little bit, but it's never really been some kind of strictly deterministic closed system, right? Your choices are always playing a role. Providence, angels, enlightened beings. Like there's a lot of things going on where where different forces or influences can come down into that realm of karma and fate, which more or less operates in a more deterministic manner. But insight into the deterministic nature of karma is gained by participating within a closed language that mirrors the realm of karma, that mirrors the stories, that mirrors the repetitive nature of the stories and the relationship of different facets of the stories to one another within those cycles. So at any rate, the divinatory model basically, though, to break it down really, really simply, suggests that the planets are omens and signs, not causes. So you could think of the planets, houses and signs of a birth chart, to make a simple analogy, like a rotating tarot deck moving through the sky. So in a sense, if you think of a birth chart, right, you got 12 houses, right? Think of each one of the houses of a birth chart like the positions in a 12-card tarot spread. You've got one card holder position for health, one for money, one for siblings, one for property and family, etc. The whole wheel has 12 different positions that the cards can hold. The planets and signs moving through the sky by means of the primary motion, just rotating round and round every day, are like a rotating deck of cards that are endlessly moving through those positions, through those card positions that represent those different dimensions of the reading. Now, the planets and signs are like the individual cards then. So like, you've got the Saturn card rather than the High Priestess, or you have the Venus card rather than, the Fool or something like that, right? So you have the different signs and planets are rotating through the different houses, like tarot cards moving through the different positions of a spread. And at any given point when you're pausing it to cast a chart, you're just freeze framing the sky, and that wherever the cards land within those houses, traditionally they were whole sign houses basically for this reason, in my opinion, then you have that becomes your reading. That's your divination, right? It's not that those things are then impressing themselves upon you, right? Like, think about this. Like, if you sit down and you say, what will my 2018 be like? And you cast 12 tarot cards in a circle, do you really believe that those 12 tarot cards are impressing into 2018 at that moment, which is a seed in time, some kind of force that will then manifest? No, nobody really believes that about tarot, because we don't have a hard time looking at a tarot spread and saying these cards are omens or signs. They're omens or signs that point to forces, laws that are at work, that are beyond rational comprehension. So nobody gets freaked out about tarot in that way, right? But with astrology, we get all crazy about it. So at any given moment in time, the sky can be thought of like a moving tarot deck. Think about it that way, and you won't get as, from my divinatory perspective, you won't get as caught up in understanding both why there are certain planetary effects happening at some time and why they're not really effects. So nobody casts a tarot spread, sees the Page of Cups and says, the Page of Cups is going to start messing with you and could cause you to get pregnant unless, you really harness the Page of Cups and make sure that the beams coming down from the Page of Cups, like, don't turn into a baby. Like, that's not how tarot is read. It's not to say that the Page of Cups couldn't show up in a reading and give you some sort of advice or insight, or, couldn't be more of a suggestion or a form of guidance. But nobody says in a spread where a Page of Cups indicates an upcoming pregnancy that the Page of Cups literally caused you to get pregnant. Nobody says if you cast the Devil card in a tarot spread that the Devil card literally caused you to get addicted to drugs that year. Right? Nobody says those things, because we understand that they're signs. If you see an eagle in nature and then you meet an important person in the next day or two, nobody says, that eagle caused you to meet that person. If you have a dream that gives you some sense of what's happening or an insight into something or a warning, no dream says it caused you to follow the advice. Nobody says that dream is causing something to happen. So now I want to be careful, because in some ways all of this is just semantics, right? But it's important, because when we walk around talking about the planets, and we don't treat them as signs and omens, then we constantly give the planets some kind of responsibility that's usually on us, right? Like, if Saturn's entering your 7th house, that's about your karma from a more traditional standpoint, or your fate, however you want to think about it. They're basically the same concepts. That's about your karma. Saturn's not messing with you, right? It's there's a flower in your garden of life, perhaps planted from previous lifetimes worth of actions and choices that you made, that's going to blossom. The planet's not messing with you. Now, Saturn entering your 7th isn't just fated events, though. Saturn entering your 7th could also appear as a warning, just like a dream where you say, I have a dream that, there's a snake there's a snake in my office drawer at work, right? And it tips you off to the fact that there's growing contention in the workplace. And so you become a little bit more mindful not to trigger it, not to get into it. Omens can act as guides. They can act as informants on things that are happening. They can give us advice, and they can be about karma and fated events. And there's not an easy and clear way of delineating those things other than practicing. See, we think from the very beginning we have to solve which is which, because we can't imagine the burden of having to sort out when an omen is a prognosticator or when it's a piece of advice. But that's a cop-out. What we need to do is actually practice divination over a long period of time. You can't throw prediction out just because you don't know how to use it. And you can't throw giving advice out or giving a warning out just because you're not sure if the person has the freedom to actually use that in a situation. Those complexities are exactly the spiritual crucible that astrology is putting an astrologer through for the sake of their own learning. That's exactly why we're doing astrology, is to learn those differences and to see where grace is where we thought it wasn't, or to see where karma is where we were way too we were projecting something that we wished for, that we shouldn't have been wishing for. But all of those lessons are part of the humility that we have to take on. We have to take up those things with humility in our hearts if we want to do astrology. That's my very charismatic opinion. So anyway, now that's the divinatory model also offers perhaps the most solid explanations as to why so many different approaches to astrology can work. Like, as long as we're in the causal, material model, and we're trying to say, well, the planets are doing things and everything like that, well, then eventually we're going to have to create a system of astrology that expands to the entire universe. All right, we're placing upon the shoulders of astrology the weight of figuring out a grand unifying theory. Good luck with that. That's not my goal, right? I fundamentally believe that if there is any grand unifying theory to be realized, that it's probably not going to be realized in any kind of intellectual sense, not any kind of like going into it with the scalpel of reason, right? To me that's fruitless. But again, that's just me. But why is it, like, there's tons of different tarot spreads that one could use and get good results on when asking about the year ahead or a difficult situation at work or something like that? Why is it that we don't give that same flexibility to the fact that so many different house systems work, or that we squabble amongst each other over which zodiac is correct? Or frankly, we see people trying to create all sorts of systems that try to unify every last freaking thing out there. Tarot, I Ching, Chinese medicine, Ayurveda, the meridian lines, all of it. It's called divination 7.0, and I've wrapped every system into one. That same kind of attitude really bothers me, because it's really not about it's not about trying to unify every single symbol that appears in the world, or every single thing that's out there, into one explanatory model. Why do different asteroids, zodiacs, house systems work? It's because when we entrain ourselves to the use of symbols within a contained system that demonstrates a cyclical intelligence, the omens have the power to speak within the system, and they can mirror, because they're a part of that closed system that's again cyclical like that. They can mirror what's happening in the realm of karma and samsara. They have the power to speak, and something from beyond can also speak through them. So, you can use asteroids, you can use different house systems, you can use those things because you're entraining yourself to the use of symbols within a closed system like that. For example, I have a student who wanted to test this theory out while we were studying together over the course of time, and she used she had like if I remember correctly, it was like a lunch pail that she kept like 100+ movie stubs in. Just stubs that she collected from going to the movies. And rather than using tarot cards, what she did, because she had a really in-depth personal relationship to movies and all of the characters and actors and their life story. I mean, she knew a ton about the characters and people and stories and movies, and like she had this encyclopedic knowledge, right, of like everything that was involved with these movies that were represented on these stubs. So when someone came for a reading, she started pulling a movie stub or several movie stubs in a spread, and it worked just as effectively as tarot. Why? How is that possible? Right? It's possible because she created a closed system, right? She created a closed system that reflects cyclical, sort of archetypal cyclical dynamics, but within a contained, within a sort of contained system. So that worked for her. It was really cool that it actually worked like that. Think about this one, for example. Most people don't even think about this, but think about transits, right? How do transits work? No, sometimes I get students who are like intelligent enough to ask. Other people just take it for granted. They're like, think about it. I'm 36 years old. How is it possible that looking at the planets in the sky today, 36 years after I was born, that the planets in the sky today, that I would look at them and then look at where they are in relationship to where they were 36 years ago, and that the relationship between where they all are now and where they all were 36 years ago, including 100 asteroids if I wanted to or not, could speak accurately about what's about to happen in my life, could offer prognostication. How is that even possible, right? Well, again, it's much easier if you think about it like a tarot spread. If you pause the spread at the moment of birth, there's my birth chart, right? And I've got the cards arranged in the wheel in their different positions. But as I've freeze framed that, the same exact spread keeps ticking now in a wheel outside of that wheel. And it's moving around the inner wheel that I paused. So now I have like a secondary tarot spread that's moving in relationship to the initial one. And it is a symbolic image of it's a symbolic image of the continued relationship between the moving tarot spread and the original spread that I cast. At which point, I pause that spread again, like today, and I say, okay, where's the outer tarot spread, the one that's kept moving since I was born, in relationship to the inner one that I paused at the moment of my birth? Then I look at the juxtaposition between the cards in the outer wheel and the cards in the inner wheel. Well, nobody has a problem with that in tarot whatsoever. Nobody stops to ask why it is that leads to accurate divinatory results. In tarot, it works like this. You have a spread, let's say 12 cards in a circle, right? For the 12 months of the year or something like that. As you're going and you're speaking with a client and you're unraveling the symbolism of each card, an interesting question arises. Something symbolically resonates and they say, oh, I think I know what that's about. And they're digging into it, and then always they say, but maybe, do you think it means this or do you think it means that? What does the tarot reader do? They flip another card and place it right on top. That's the exact same logic at work. It's the exact same kind of divinatory logic that's at work, and nobody stops to question it whatsoever. The reason that nobody stops to question it is because people don't question divination. They don't question it because they recognize that to understand how divination works is a different kind of knowledge acquisition process. You have to somehow enter into it to understand it. So I liked, for that reason, like, let's say that right now, let's say Venus card was rising when I was born. Venus is rising. So the Venus card is like in the first house, the first position. Now in the outer wheel, Saturn has come to be at the opposite side of the chart, facing that Venus. How do I look at the juxtaposition of those cards in order to read them as an omen? It could be a warning. It could be a set of instructions. It could be a literal prognostication. And a good reader knows when the difference is to go to which because of experience, or they might list all of the above: a little bit of instruction, a little bit of advice, a little bit of insight, and a little bit of prognostication. So again, and you can't learn that by any other way than doing it. At the outset, trying to define or determine how astrology exists so that you can try to get around the difficulties of having all of that present at once within an omen is to fundamentally disrespect the nature of omens. And nobody has a hard time, nobody disrespects omens when they're, having tarot cards cast. Nobody really, in my experience, nobody spends as much time trying to solve how it is that tarot cards work. Because there's a more deeply numinous, mysterious, and just kind of awe-inspiring reverence for omens. But, the sky, because there's math and there's sort of like a science involved, again, we drop right out of the heart a lot of the times. Anyway, those are my thoughts there. The divinatory model also explains why the history of astrology is replete with so many different non-literal methods of interpretation, like, for example, profections. Well, what are you doing with a profection? In an annual profection, you're advancing a whole sign house in the chart by one year and one whole sign house at a time. It's an incredibly accurate prognostication system. Time Lords are the same way. They're numerological. Progressions, symbolic progressions of the chart that are not based in literal movements of the planets. All of those things, right? They're pointing toward a model of divination. Now, so I would say, you know, that the tarot analogy is really helpful for people when they're first encountering astrology. And when you start just unworking the mind from thinking that the planets are literally doing something to you. Think of the planets like a tarot card. Think of them like the dream image. That also immediately usually helps people solve the dilemmas between things like fate and free will. An omen, if you ever watch the show Vikings, which I'm really into right now, is my descendants are some ways from the Vikings, so I was interested in the show. There's a seer in the village that all the Viking people go and see all the time. He's someone who can give them warnings. He's someone who can give them the decrees of the gods. He's someone who can say, I can't tell you. He's someone who can say, here's some advice, but you won't listen. Here's someone who can say, you can change this, you must go and do this. All of that information is part of what divination is capable of, right? So again, we stumble over that kind of stuff a lot because we don't understand the planets as omens. So let's see, where are my notes here? Now, because our ritual is mathematical and astronomical, we get confused. And I would like to see this view of the planets and as astrology as more omen and oracular, because I think it shuts down a lot of debates that are really unnecessary at any rate. And it teaches you the real way of learning about the intelligence behind astrology is to do it. It's like someone coming up to you and saying, hey, you want to understand the benefits of meditation? Let me tell you about it, right? Like most people are like, don't I have to meditate to figure that out? You know what I mean? Like, isn't there some kind of like, I have to like actually participate in the meditating to understand what it delivers? And we forget that about divination, right? So a lot of people in the beginning, we overcompensate. We try to come up with theories that demonstrate the validity of astrology so that people will believe in it. But it's the other way around. You believe in astrology long before most people have an experience with astrology that causes them to believe. And from that point forward, the actual practicing of astrology is what leads to the understanding of the intelligence behind the generative force. That's very, very important. Finally, last thing I'll say is that I do believe that because astrology is so mathematical and astronomical, it could said to be, it is probably the most yang form of divination that our planet has ever seen. In my opinion, astrology is a very masculine form of divination. And that doesn't mean that only men are interested in it. I think that it appeals to a more like it appeals to, in yoga, there's a whole set of yogis that are called, they're interested in jnana, which is like knowledge. And that's a path to liberation, to insight, to spiritual freedom. And I believe that astrology falls in line with people who are really interested in studying the mechanics of karma and fate. Anything that we devote ourselves to with full love, whether it's singing bhakti songs to God, right? Or whether it's a more hardcore study of the science of karma. I think either way, where it leads you, if you stay devoted in heart, is to God, is to the divine, is to spirit. That's how I conceptualize it. But ultimately, I do believe that we also have to be very careful that we are including studies that are feminine, right? So, tarot for me is the sort of the face of the popular face of the feminine in divination, because it's imagistic and it's visual and it depicts scenes from life and people and places and colors and it has to me it has a more feminine mood surrounding it. And so I think it's very important, if you really want to not have astrology turn into just a super mental thing, for it to be an actual devotional practice that moves the soul, that helps the spirit actually, I guess, progress on the spiritual path. I do think that it has to be countered with devotional things. Now, a lot of people have no problem with that. I know a lot of people who study astrology who are, they sing, they dance, they get into the body, they're doing breath work, that, and good. That's great. I think also studying a more feminine form of divination is important. Now, that's not to say there aren't deeply feminine aspects of astrology. I'm just saying overall, the math and science part of astrology, I think, have a more sort of yang vibe to it. So so that's important. And then I think last but not least, like, I mean, I can tell you how many of my students, when I try to get them to imagine the moving tarot deck in the sky, something immediately just opens up. It's like, thank you. I can get down with that, right? I can immediately enter into it. The doors come just wide open right away. The other thing is that real divination, in my opinion, really good divination, it has to have the power to predict and prognosticate as well as to advise. So nowadays, a lot of people really hate prediction. But for thousands of years, if you go to see a seer, a sage, a prophet, a guru, people who study these things or have enlightened powers have a combination of advice-giving ability, counseling, and prognostication. To shy away from prognostication and to create some elaborate model of how there is no such thing as fate or destiny or karma, to me, is completely foolish. Now, people could disagree with me. That'd be fine. Whatever. As I always like to say, I would never want to lose a friend over any of this. But in my opinion, one of the benefits of studying traditional astrology that I've run into, as well as things like horary, that have tighter methodologies for prognostication and prediction, that you can actually see that these things are not, they work. And so for me, it's very important that for divination to be really good, you have to have a contained system. You have to have consistent methodologies that you entrain yourself to. You have to know why you use them, and you have to be able to use them both to give knowledge, advice, or counseling, to facilitate a psychological kind of co-creative experience with someone, as well as to prognosticate and predict. And you have to figure out how to do those two things at once. I have not found anything better than studying Hellenistic astrology, medieval astrology, Indian astrology, and horary astrology for developing that side of the skill in astrology. So I really recommend that more people check that out. That's specifically why I developed my course, Ancient Astrology for Modern Times. So if you're interested in learning more about that, you could always check out, shameless self-promotion here, you could always check out my website, nightlightastrology.com, for more on that. That's all that I wanted to say today. What I've been trying to do with these video blogs is, have more content in addition to the daily forecasting, weekly and monthly forecasting, so that I'm offering challenging and interesting philosophical insight. They're also going to be really practical things. So coming up in the next couple of months, I also plan on doing very simple things like how to think about houses and signs and planets, and how to think about a planet entering a certain house. And so there'll be craft-based stuff as well as philosophical stuff. All right. Thanks everybody for listening. Let me see if I see, there's a whole bunch of stuff here that I missed. Right. So I'm seeing a bunch of things here. Let's see if you haven't missed any questions. I didn't want to miss any questions, but I want to stay, but need to get girls to school. Hey, Ursula, I'm glad you could be here. Rose, almost as frustrating as when non-tarot readers question my tarot reading. Ugh. Yeah. This is why it is called practice. Interaction is a necessary piece of it. I love that. Ragnar. Yeah, totally. It is completely accurate and meaningful. You have to participate in the ritual to know and understand the ritual. No, it does not cause them to believe a tarot reading. Planetary energies are felt and explained so that one can control themselves on how to react to other people's responses of planetary energies. Right. So I basically, I already sort of, Vicky, I'm not sure if you were here for the whole thing or not, but I basically would take a very different philosophical position from your own there. But you probably, if you missed the first part of the talk, then you would have heard me talking about that. But yeah, let's see. Spirit is with us always, and you pull a tarot card, the reader is opening a brain portal according to the essence and history of that specific card. Maybe. I don't know if I agree with that particularly, but I know that, there's a lot of interesting ways of thinking about it, perhaps. All right. Well, the Ancient Astrology for Modern Times class, you can find it at nightlightastrology.com. I put it in the chat box right there. It meets, let's see, next one is starting up in May, late May, early June, and we go for a whole year together, 32 weeks, about 3 hours a pop, and we study ancient astrology, and we try to develop the predictive skill, and then we learn about how to marry that to counseling skills that and psychological skills that modern astrology has done such a nice job of providing us with. So that's really the goal of the course. All right, you guys have a good day. Take care, everyone. Bye.